One thing about this bike that's pretty readily apparent is it was a used functional bike, which unfortunately means there tends to be a lot of damage due to the bike lock. Both when they were riding with the bike lock on it, it was a chain lock that it had, and I'm sure they were using something similar its whole life. And from just latching it onto things, it bumping up against things. Like I say, I'm not going to invest the time required to strip and repaint this. I kind of like the look of a bike that's had some honest use. What I do want to do though is to clean up the paint a little bit and give it a little bit more of its original color. The color was fairly dark. If you look down here in this area, you can see, and so that's the original color. So the whole bike is faded to one extent or the other. Gone in and used automotive rubbing compound, cutting compound, whatever you want to call it, that removes a little bit of a layer of paint up to about right here. And so you can see it is considerably darker and shinier in this area than it is in this area. So that's probably what I'm going to do with the whole finish. It would be impossible to match the paint on this bike. It's not the original color anymore because of fading. Another good example of a little bit of polishing. This side I polished. This side I have not yet, and you can see this is considerably darker, has a considerably better shine to it. So just a little bit of rubbing compound and elbow grease really can go a long way in cleaning up the overall appearance. I picked up most of the parts that I'm going to need for the bike. As far as the brakes, these brake pads were completely dry rotted basically. So I picked up some cool stop pads. If you are using a bike with old brakes like this, particularly ones with steel rims that can be kind of smooth in many cases, the cool stop pads are a really good idea. They're very effective brake pads, better than some of the standard type. The original saddle that was on the bike is long gone. The saddle that was on it in the earlier video was pretty awful. I put this one on to ride it just a little bit, but I have picked up a Charge brand saddle. These are quite inexpensive saddles that for me are a good fit and are good quality. They wear well. It's not exactly the type of saddle this bike would have had originally, but that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make for ride comfort. So I have picked up a set of tires. When you look at the original pictures from the catalog, this bike did have gum wall tires, so I decided to go back with that look. So I picked up a set of Panaracer Pacellas. I'm pretty fond of Panaracer tires in general. I've had really good luck with them. There's not a tremendous number of options available for these kind of tires, for 27-inch tires, but Panaracer does have these Pacellas. They have the Pro-Type version that has better puncture protection, but those right now are pretty much impossible to obtain. One of the other for sure to do things on any sort of a vintage bike like this is to replace all the cables, unless you know for sure they've been replaced recently. These look decent, but cables are inexpensive. You might as well have a good set. You can see on this there's a pretty bad bend in that one that's probably going to limit the way the cable moves in the housing. One of the more challenging things to work on these older bikes are the cottered cranks. You have to take the cranks off in order to re-lube, check the bearings, etc. in the bottom bracket. But the cotters, which are basically a pin with a nut on one end to keep it from vibrating loose right here in the middle, there's not really a great way to get them out. They're driven in. The nut just kind of makes sure they don't slip back, and so they have to be driven back out. This weird looking contraption here is a way to try to minimize the problems with that. It basically supports the crank so that when you take your hammer to the pin, you're not pounding the axle or the bearings or things like that too vigorously. Instead, you're primarily working on the pin itself. So I'm going to give this one a shot and see if we can get it popped out this way. I'm going to give the first try of this with a rubber mallet. Some of the Experts recommend that you just start out with a steel hammer because you need to get as much impact as you can. I just have a hard time starting off with a steel paste hammer, but I'll probably end up there. Yeah, I think we better get the real hammer. The general theory, if you read up on online, is the more hits you make, the more damage you could potentially do. So most people say you might as well hit it hard the first time. And we got it. I think the nut's going to be a little worse for wear, but I think the cutter is going to be okay. Maybe. And so we got it. We'll take our little brace out from underneath here. So I've got both the crank arms off, and that's not much of a process on these cottered cranks. They're fairly loose usually. You can usually just pull them off by wobbling them back and forth. But the reason you do this is, even though it felt like when you turn the pedals over there wasn't a lot of friction in the bottom bracket, you're using a big long lever arm with the pedal, so it's kind of hard to tell. Hopefully the microphone on the camera will pick up the grinding noise when I turn this. Even if it's not, you can see how roughly it's moving. So I'm going to say that the bearings in there are quite corroded and have probably no lubrication at all. And that's quite typical even for a well cared for older bike. If it hasn't been maintained recently, that happens with those kind of bearings. So our next thing will be to open that up, and we'll clean it out and see what we need to replace.